Number 5, church. Courtly love and church. We just talked about courtly love and feudal society, political structure. Now let's move to the church. There's no question that courtly love, as a total of hundreds and hundreds of poems and hundreds of poets, was anti-clerical, anti-church. And it was full of poetry that attacked or laughed at or criticized the church and priests, with stories of priests and their concubines. And we know that some of them were actually atheists. That is, you can read by looking at their commentary or letters or poets or something that they really were atheists. So it's a very radical movement. That is, for the 12th century, as I say there, in the 12th century, atheism is not out of the closet. That is, you don't say right out, you're an atheist, but you can sometimes read it. And worse than the fact that the courtly love poets were anti-church, there's also within it real heresy. So let's just stop here for just a second and talk a little bit about the Cathar heresy. Catharism came from Bulgaria and Romania. It was a very strange eruption of religious ideas that came from the East, filtered through Iran, Iraq, filtered through Constantinople, and then settled in this particular part of Romania and Bulgaria, and became known as the Cathars, and then that name was carried into Europe. And it was essentially a Manichaean religious interpretation of the world in which everything good is up in heaven and everything bad is down here among us. So this world down here where we live is dirty and corrupt and awful, and it's all and it's sinful, and we're bad. Now, this is a very old idea. This wasn't the only time it appeared. It went way, way, way back, thousands of years. It became known as the Manichaean interpretation of things because it recurred again and again and again. The Manichaean came out of Persia. There was actually a man named Mani, M-A-N-I, and people in the time of Augustine and Jerome knew all about Mani and his writings in Manichaean ideas, and Augustine was somewhat attracted. So this is an old idea. But here in the 12th century, it comes all back, and it is part of a world of doubt and self-doubt and a view of the world that's in flux, and that and it probably was born in the world of crusades and invasions. In any case, it traveled. It was picked up and brought back to Europe by crusaders or people with the crusades, but it certainly was carried by the crusades and brought back to Europe in the 1100s, back to northern Spain and southern France, and settles in certain areas. And the one part of Europe where it becomes most numerous and becomes dominant is southwestern France. So the Cathar heresy flourishes in the south of France. And we think that it and its beliefs influences certain courtly love poets. And one of the things that was part of the Cathar belief system was that we here in this dirty world that we live in should try to release ourselves out of it, somewhat in the way of Indian religion. That is, through each cycle you become less and less material and more spiritual. Well, that's the way the Cathar heresy saw things. And so part of that would be to refuse to allow your life to be caught up in the physical body, meaning sex. And so since there are things in the courtly love, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that touch that very idea, we think probably Cathar heresy encouraged this. So we can come back to it. But for sure, courtly love is anti-Roman Catholic Church, makes enemies. So Bernard of Clairvaux hated the courtly love poetry, hated the poets, and therefore didn't like Eleanor of Aquitaine when she came to Paris, because he knew she had lots of courtly love poets in her court, And that's where the word comes from, court, from the court of the princes, courtly. And that's part of the reason that he didn't like it and didn't like her. Number 6, what is the ethic of love? What is the ethic of courtly love? And remember, there are many definitions of love through the centuries. We read Paul's letter to the Corinthians about love. This is all different. Of course, it's the same word. It's the word love, but there are many interpretations. Tonight here we're talking about European language and French and English using the word love and meaning passion, passionate eros. So, number 6. What are some of the ideas of courtly love? Well, at the very center of courtly love is the ethic or the worship of love, which requires that the lover, the man, the poet, serve his lady, just as you would in a feudal world. And he is serving her by writing, singing, pretending to be her slave, so that's a lot of the language. He praises his lady, he loves his lady, he idealizes his lady, just the way Dante will do in his poem. He won't sleep with his lady. In general, he's not in that position. He can't. But he writes poems that sound like he would like to or might have or has heard a lot about what it's like, because he's going to talk a lot about it, even though he probably can't do it. But he talks about it all the time, and he is driven wild by the fact that he can't. So that's our poem with Bernard de Ventendorn tonight that we're going to read here in a second. That poem is exactly what we're talking about. And the lady is Eleanor. Now, often the husband would get irritated when handsome, articulate, tall, broad-shouldered, sexy guys would come into the court and sit in the middle of the court and sing in their tights and sing beautiful songs to the lady, the Duchess, Eleanor, and praise her and say how beautiful she was and how much he'd like to sleep with her. A lot of husbands were very irritated by this. And so after a while, they would often be driven out by angry husbands, which is what happened to Bernard de Ventendorn. He started singing songs to the Countess of the Chateau of Ventendorn, and the head of the chateau, the local knight who was the count, got sick of it and said, "Get thee out. Hit the road, Jack. Bernie. Hit the road, Jack, Bernie. And don't come back no more. And so Bernard did, and ended up in Eleanor's court in Poitiers, writing songs to her. But the imagery, it's very erotic. It's filled with imagery, and much of it very sophisticated, double entendre, triple entendre, quadruple entendre. But he's not really sleeping with her. Now, here's the key part of courtly love. In courtly love, the love of courtly love requires suffering. There's nothing else to it if there's no suffering. So, therefore, present day practices over here at Stanford University in the dorms, where 4 or 5 buddies go on down to the pizza place, then go back to the dorm afterwards, and then on their way to their rooms in the hallway, somebody hooks up, Mary with John hooks up, has nothing to do with courtly love, see, because jumping into bed with somebody for a couple of hours and jumping back out of bed then and rushing off to class is the opposite of courtly love, see, because there's no connection and there's no suffering. In courtly love, the whole essence of the courtly love is the denial of the physical gratification, and so all of it is about suffering the denial of the requited love. This is unrequited love, and because of the experience, you are transformed. Therefore, all of courtly love and all the poetry of courtly love stresses the barriers to sexual completion, fulfillment. So, for example, in some very famous scenes and some very famous poems of courtly love, Tristan and Isolde is one of them, there are scenes where the lovers, who can't be lovers because they're not married, but are on a journey where a knight is helping the lady get somewhere, sleep overnight in a bed, in an inn, which often happened. Often you slept in one bed with multiple people in the bed because you had to, because there weren't that many beds. This wasn't like, country inn or, quality suites, where you can have as many beds as you want. There'd be one bed. And so in the poem, they sleep next to each other all night. They never touch each other. And the knight lays down his sword between them as a symbol of the barrier between them. It's a very great scene, great important moment. And the poet is intentionally saying to you, who's listening to the poem that's being recited at court, these two will not have sex because this sword is the symbol of the separation which they will abide by. So all of this poetry has important episodes, important stories, important icons that symbolize the barriers to the sexual act. So the whole ethic is one in which one pines for one's love, suffers for one's love, misses her, I'm saying her, but you can substitute the sex that you care about, misses, eternally away from, can't see, substitute the sex, because her husband will kill you if you do. It's very simple. It's very simple. That's it. You see, you get it? It's very simple. You suffer because you can't have her, because if you even try to get up into the tower, her husband will have you arrested and castrated. So you can see how Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot is the perfect courtly love story. You see, you can see it's just perfect. Because Lancelot and Guinevere are in love with each other, and they can't have each other. It's too important that Lancelot stay loyal to Arthur, Arthur stay loyal, the whole, you know the story. So, everything about courtly love, which then gives us, in Western literature, one of the key ideas, is the one that you're reading on the screen right now, the transformative power of love. That's the key idea. The transformative power of love, of romantic love, of erotic, romantic, courtly love. All the poetry, all the literature, all the stories, Pt.2 and everybody else stresses these barriers. And in these barriers, one is tested, one suffers, and in the suffering, you are transformed. In that experience, you are forced to grow. You are forced to seek out strengths you didn't know you had. You are forced to learn limitations. You are forced to go forward without what you wanted. And, of course, you're forced to confront the power of love. All of this has to do with the experience of not getting the person you wanted. Now, I will bet anything there's someone in this room who had exactly that experience and will come to me in an email or privately or someplace in the next week or two and will write to me and say, I know exactly what you were talking about. Because every time I've ever done this lecture, it happens. Every single time. The first time I did this at Stanford University, I had 100 people in the room from all over the world, all different countries, different fields, graduates in the law school, graduates in the business school, people from China, people from India. And after the lecture, I got an email from one of the Chinese students. And he was doing this, making the Western mind. And he said, he sat transfixed by the lecture of courtly love. He'd never heard of it before, but that it was exactly his experience that had changed his life, because he had come to Stanford. I shouldn't do this on the television, should I? although I guess it's far enough away and far enough in time. And no names, no names. Had come to Stanford at the same time that the wife of his best friend in China had also come to Stanford. So the two of them had come, of course, known each other all their lives. So there they are at Stanford. And at Stanford, they're spending time together. They, have China in common, speak Chinese. They discovered that they had fallen in love with each other. But she was totally loyal to her husband at home, and he was totally loyal to his friend at home, so they never touched each other. But they had discovered that they were madly in love with each other. She was in love with her husband, and he was madly in love with her. But nothing ever happened, and she went home to China to her husband. So he said he knew exactly what my lecture was about, because now he lived with this knowledge of the fact that this woman, but that in the experience he had grown to be a greater, more profound person. So it always happens. And so it's the proof of what these poets in the 12th century believed, which was that in this experience, now this isn't anybody planned this. Nobody had this in their mind when they got started. This is what emerged in the literature. But what emerged was that in this suffering you are transformed, made better, made greater, made richer, and therefore the unique creation of courtly love is the evocation of this image of love as suffering, and it leads to all of the later centuries of Western civilization and images of love, including Dante, that we will talk about in a few weeks. We could have a huge long list of books, poems, stories. That should be literature, not iterature. And you'll see that it contains this courtly love idea. And that's what we mean when we say that they invented the idea of love. We mean they invented the idea of courtly love. That is, love and the transformative power of love, which can change your lives forever.